The knock didn't sound like a landlord demanding rent. It sounded like a sledgehammer. Outside stood a man, cloaked in leather and violence, sent to collect blood money. But behind the splintering wood, he didn't find a thief. He found a shivering boy whose whisper could break a monster's soul. The winter of 2019 hit the rotting industrial outskirts of Detroit with a cruel, unapologetic vengeance. Inside apartment 4B on Ashwood Drive, the cold wasn't just a temperature. It was a physical entity, a relentless predator that seeped through the cracked window panes and settled deep into the bones of Clara Holden. Clara, 32 but carrying the exhaustion of a woman twice her age, sat at a chipped formica kitchen table, staring at the remnants of their survival. The inventory was a tragedy laid bare under the flickering, yellowed light of a single overhead bulb, half a box of stale generic cereal, a bruised apple, and a single dented can of chicken noodle soup. That was it. That was the entirety of their sustenance. In the adjacent room, huddled beneath 3 thin, moth-eaten blankets on a mattress that rested directly on the hardwood floor, was her 7-year-old son, Toby. His small, raspy coughs punctuated the heavy silence of the apartment. Every cough felt like a physical blow to Clara's chest. How had it come to this? The descent into absolute ruin hadn't been an overnight plunge, but a slow, agonizing slide orchestrated by the man who was supposed to protect them. Simon Trent. Simon with his charming smile and a crippling addiction to high-stakes underground poker. 3 weeks ago, Simon had packed a single duffel bag in the dead of night and vanished into the freezing Michigan darkness. He didn't leave a note. He didn't say goodbye to his son. What he did leave, however, was a debt. A massive, suffocating debt of $45,000. And he didn't owe it to a bank or a loan shark who would just break a few fingers. Simon owed it to the local charter of the Hells Angels, men who dealt in absolute, terrifying finality. Clara rubbed her eyes, her hands trembling from a combination of fear and severe caloric deficit. She hadn't eaten in 2 days, saving the few scraps of food they had left for Toby. Her stomach had stopped growling, replaced by a dull, hollow ache that radiated through her entire body. Her bank accounts were frozen, drained to the negative by Simon before his cowardly retreat. The electricity was scheduled to be shut off by Friday. It was Wednesday. "Mommy!" The small, fragile voice broke Clara out of her spiraling panic. Toby was standing in the doorway, clutching a worn-out stuffed bear. His oversized sweater hung off his thinning frame, and his large blue eyes looked hollowed out, shadowed by dark circles. "Hey, sweetie," Clara forced a smile, quickly wiping a stray tear from her cheek. She stood up, her knees momentarily buckling from weakness before she steadied herself. "You should be under the covers. It's freezing out here." "I'm hungry," Toby whispered, his voice barely carrying over the rattling of the ancient radiator that pumped out more noise than heat. Clara's heart seized. She walked over, wrapping her arms around his small, frail body. He felt so light. Too light. "I know, baby, I know. Come here." She led him to the table and picked up the dented can of soup. It was their last hot meal. She had been saving it, stretching out the cereal as long as possible, terrified of the moment when there would be nothing left to reach for in the cupboards. "I'm going to heat this up for you," Clara said softly, reaching for the manual can opener. Toby looked at the can, then up at his mother, his brow furrowed with a profound, terrifying understanding that no 7-year-old should possess. He reached out, his tiny, ice-cold fingers wrapping around Clara's wrist, stopping her from opening the tin. "Mommy," Toby said, his voice trembling as he looked directly into her tear-filled eyes. "If we eat today, will we starve tomorrow?" The question hung in the freezing air, sharp and devastating as a guillotine blade. If we eat today, will we starve tomorrow? It shattered whatever fragile dam Clara had left, holding her emotions in check. A sob ripped from her throat, raw and agonizing. She pulled Toby into her chest, burying her face in his hair, crying silently as the reality of their impending doom crashed over her. She couldn't answer him. She couldn't promise him tomorrow. She was utterly powerless, waiting in an icebox of an apartment for either starvation to take them, or for the violent men Simon had robbed to kick down the door and claim their pound of flesh. She didn't know that the Reaper was already on his way, 5 miles away, tearing down the desolate, sleet-slicked stretch of Ash 94. Was Silas Iron Montgomery? Silas was a mountain of a man, standing 6'4", with shoulders built like a concrete bunker. The heavy leather cut of the Hells Angels flapped wildly against the freezing wind, the iconic death's head patch on his back a warning to the world. Silas was the sergeant-at-arms for the Detroit Charter. It was his job to maintain discipline, enforce the rules, and when necessary, collect what the club was owed. And Simon Trent owed them deeply. The story, as told to the club president, was that Simon hadn't just lost the $45,000 at a club-sponsored table. The twist was far more sinister. The club's accountant had discovered a paper trail suggesting Simon had embezzled an additional $20,000 from a club-owned front business, routing the money directly into an offshore account under Clara Holden's name. The narrative was clear. Simon and his wife had played the Hells Angels for fools. Simon had fled to draw the heat, and Clara was sitting on the stolen cash, waiting for the dust to settle before joining him. Silas's orders were simple and brutally explicit. Go to the Ashwood apartment, tear the place apart, get the money, or take it out of the woman. Silas downshifted, his custom Harley roaring like a wounded beast as he pulled onto Ashwood Drive. The neighborhood was a graveyard of the American dream, boarded-up windows, stripped cars resting on cinder blocks, and the pervasive stench of desperation. He parked his bike on the cracked sidewalk right in front of the duplex, not bothering to chain it. Nobody in their right mind would touch a bike bearing that insignia. He killed the engine. The sudden silence was heavy, broken only by the crunch of his heavy combat boots on the icy pavement. His face, scarred from a decade of bar fights and asphalt, was an impassive mask of stone. Silas didn't feel pity. Pity was a liability in his world. He had convinced himself that the woman inside was a grifter, a thief who had stolen from his brothers. He reached the door of apartment 4B. He didn't knock politely. He raised his heavy, steel-toed boot and kicked the door right at the handle. The flimsy wood splintered, the deadbolt tearing out of the frame with a loud crack. The door swung open violently, crashing against the interior wall. Silas stepped into the apartment, ducking his head slightly to clear the frame. He brought his right hand to the heavy combat knife sheathed on his belt. "Clara Holden!" His voice boomed, rattling the very walls of the tiny room. "Where is the money?" Inside, the scene was not what he expected. There were no packed bags, no hidden safes, no signs of a woman preparing for a luxurious getaway. There was only Clara, backing into the corner of the kitchen, her eyes wide with a primal, suffocating terror. And standing directly in front of her, forming a pathetic but fiercely brave human shield, was a 7-year-old boy. Silas paused, his imposing shadow stretching across the linoleum floor. The apartment was freezing, colder inside than it was out on the street. He could see his own breath pluming in the air. I don't have it," Clara stammered, her voice shaking so violently she could barely form the words. She tried to pull Toby behind her, but the boy planted his feet, glaring up at the giant intruder. "Simon left us. He drained the accounts. We have nothing. Please, I swear to God, we have nothing." Silas narrowed his eyes, stepping further into the room. His gaze swept the kitchen. He saw the chipped table. He saw the single, dented can of soup sitting next to a manual can opener. He saw the hollow, starving look in the mother's eyes, and the shivering, emaciated frame of the boy. His trained eye, honed by years of sniffing out liars and informants, looked for the telltale signs of a scam. He looked for hidden electronics, expensive shoes tossed in a corner, the smell of decent food. There was nothing but the scent of stale dust and despair. "Simon Trent wired 20 grand into an account with your name on it," Silas growled, though the absolute conviction in his voice wavered slightly as he looked at the shivering child. "You're sitting on club money. My president wants it back." "What account?" Clara cried out, genuine confusion cutting through her terror. "I don't even have a savings account. He took my debit card. Look around you. Do you think we would be living like this if I had $20,000? We are starving." Toby, who had been staring at the massive death's head patch on Silas's leather vest, suddenly took a half step forward. Clara gasped, reaching for him. But Toby was quicker. He looked up at the towering, terrifying biker, his small face pale but resolute. "Are you the monster?" Toby asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. Silas froze. The question hit him completely off guard. "What?" "My dad said if he didn't pay the monsters, they would come eat us," Toby said, his innocent logic slicing right through the tension in the room. He reached into the pocket of his oversized sweater and pulled out a small, lint-covered, half-eaten Pop-Tart. It was wrapped in a piece of paper towel. He held it out toward Silas with a trembling hand. "You can have my food, but please don't hurt my mommy. If you take all our food, we'll starve tomorrow." The words echoed in Silas's mind. "If you take all our food, we'll starve tomorrow." Time seemed to stop. Silas Montgomery, a man who had broken jaws with his bare hands, who had ridden through rival gang territory with a shotgun strapped to his back, felt something snap deep within his chest. It was a physical sensation, a sudden, sharp pain that had nothing to do with a blade or a bullet. It was his heart, heavily guarded and calloused by years of violence, shattering in absolute silence. He looked at the lint-covered pastry in the boy's hand. Then he looked at Clara, who was weeping silently, her hands covering her mouth. The truth hit Silas like a freight train. Simon hadn't just stolen from the club. The coward had set up a fake, untraceable ghost account using his wife's stolen identity to throw the Hells Angels off his scent. He had used his own starving wife and child as bait, leaving them to take the brutal, bloody fall while he escaped with the cash. Slowly, deliberately, Silas took his hand off the hilt of his knife. The terrifying aura of the sergeant-at-arms dissipated, replaced by a profound, agonizing guilt. He had kicked in the door of a starving family, ready to do violence over a lie. Silas slowly sank to one knee, bringing himself down to Toby's eye level. The leather of his cut creaked in the quiet room. He gently pushed Toby's small hand, the one holding the Pop-Tart, back toward the boy's chest. "Keep your food, little man," Silas said, his gruff voice softening to a low, gravelly rumble. He reached into his own heavy leather jacket. Clara flinched, expecting a weapon, but instead, Silas pulled out a thick wad of emergency cash, $3,000 bound by a rubber band, meant for bribes or bail money. He placed the stack of bills on the Formica table next to the dented can of soup. "I'm not the monster," Silas whispered, looking up at Clara, his dark eyes burning with a sudden, lethal promise. Not against her, but against the man who had done this. "But I know where to find him." The heavy oak door of the Detroit chapter's clubhouse slammed shut behind Silas, rattling the framed photographs of fallen brothers lining the corridor. The air inside was thick with the scent of stale beer, cigar smoke, and leather, a stark contrast to the freezing, sterile despair he had just left at Ashwood Drive. Silas didn't head for the bar where the rest of the patched members were nursing local drafts and playing billiards. He walked straight past them, his boots thudding ominously against the scarred floorboards, heading directly for the back office. The men parted for him. When the sergeant-at-arms had that specific, dead-eyed look, nobody asked questions. Sitting behind a massive, cluttered mahogany desk was Jack Reynolds, the chapter president. Jack was a veteran of the road, his beard greying but his eyes as sharp as cut glass. Beside him, nervously tapping a pen against a stack of printed bank statements, was Arthur Pendleton, the club's painfully thin, bespectacled accountant. "Well?" Jack grunted, not looking up from a ledger. "You got the club's money, Silas? Or did you have to leave a mess in that apartment?" Silas planted his hands on the desk, leaning his massive frame over the wood. "There was no money, Jack. Just a freezing apartment, a woman who hasn't eaten in 2 days, and a kid offering me a stale pastry so I wouldn't hurt his mother." Jack finally looked up, his brow furrowing. "What the hell are you talking about? Arthur showed us the paper trail. 20 grand wired to Clara Holden's account. Simon Trent set it up." Silas turned his gaze slowly to Arthur. The accountant swallowed hard, the Adam's apple bobbing in his skinny throat. A bead of sweat formed at Arthur's hairline, despite the drafty chill of the clubhouse. "Show me the routing numbers, Arthur," Silas demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly register. "Show me the signature cards. Show me the IP address where that account was opened." I gave all the files to Jack," Arthur stammered, his fingers trembling as he pushed his glasses up his nose. "It's all offshore, Silas. Cayman routing. It's standard ghost account procedure. Simon was a rat." Silas reached across the desk with blinding speed, his massive hand clamping down on Arthur's collar. He hoisted the accountant out of his chair, sending a stack of ledgers crashing to the floor. Jack stood up, alarmed, but didn't intervene. He knew Silas well enough to know he didn't act without reason. "Simon Trent is a degenerate gambler who couldn't spell offshore if you spotted him the vowels," Silas snarled, dragging Arthur around the desk. "He doesn't know how to mask IP addresses. But you do, Arthur. You run the club's digital security. You wash the books." "Silas, back off!" Arthur shrieked, his shoes scraping frantically against the floorboards as Silas hauled him toward the back exit. "Jack, tell him. Let him talk, Arthur," Jack said coldly, crossing his arms. The pieces were rapidly falling into place in the president's mind. Silas kicked the heavy metal fire door open, dragging the accountant out into the freezing, snow-swept alley behind the bar. He slammed Arthur against the brick wall, pinning him there with a forearm across his chest. "I looked into that woman's eyes," Silas said, his voice a lethal whisper over the howling wind. She was waiting to die. Simon used her identity to set up a dummy account, and he couldn't have done it without internal access to the club's routing software. "How much did he pay you to frame his wife and kid, Arthur? How much to point the Reaper at a starving 7-year-old? Arthur sobbed, his bravado entirely shattered under the crushing weight of Silas's forearm. $5,000, he choked out, gasping for air. "He said he needed a diversion. He said if the club thought she had the money, you'd go after her, and he could slip away. I just fabricated the wire transfer logs." "Where is he?" Silas pressed his arm harder, cutting off Arthur's oxygen, just enough to induce panic. "Toledo," Arthur gasped. "The Starlight Motel, room 114. He's waiting for a guy to bring him a fake Canadian passport tonight. He has the 45,000 in cash in a duffel bag. Silas dropped him. Arthur crumpled to the icy pavement, coughing and weeping. Silas looked back at the doorway, where Jack Reynolds was standing, his face an unreadable mask of fury. "Clean out your desk, Arthur," Jack said quietly. "Then you're going to take a long ride with a few of the brothers. We'll discuss your severance package in the woods." Silas didn't wait to watch the accountant's fate. He strode to his Harley, swinging his leg over the leather seat. The storm was picking up, the sleet turning to heavy, blinding snow. But Silas didn't care. Toledo was a 50-mile ride straight south, and hell was coming with him. The Starlight Motel sat on a desolate stretch of highway just over the Ohio border. It was a miserable, neon-lit purgatory where desperate people went to hide or disappear. The flickering red no vacancy sign buzzed loudly, casting a bloody hue over the snow-covered parking lot. Silas parked his bike out of sight behind a rusted dumpster. He didn't want the roar of the engine announcing his arrival. He moved silently through the shadows, the biting wind whipping his leather cut around him. He found room 114 at the back of the complex. The curtains were drawn tightly shut, but a sliver of yellow light bled through the crack, along with the muffled sound of a television playing a late-night infomercial. Silas didn't bother with the lock. He didn't bother with a warning. He took 3 massive steps back and launched himself forward, driving the heel of his steel-toed boot dead center into the door just below the handle. The cheap wood exploded inward, the door frame shattering as it tore away from the hinges. Inside, Simon Trent screamed. He was sitting on the edge of a stained, floral print bed, a bottle of cheap bourbon in one hand and a stack of $100 bills in the other. A black duffel bag sat open on the mattress, overflowing with the club's stolen cash. Simon scrambled backward, dropping the money, his eyes wide with absolute terror as Silas Montgomery filled the broken doorway. The sheer size of the biker, covered in snow and radiating pure, unadulterated violence, froze Simon to his core. "No, please!" Simon begged, scrambling against the headboard, holding his hands up in a pathetic attempt to shield his face. "I have the money. It's right here. Take it all." Silas stepped into the room, kicking the splintered door out of his way. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't need one. He walked slowly to the bed, grabbed Simon by the front of his expensive, heavy winter coat, and hauled him to his feet. "You left them to starve," Silas stated, his voice dangerously calm. It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. "I had to," Simon cried, tears of cowardice streaming down his face. "The club would have killed me. I needed time. Clara is strong. She would have figured it out." Silas's fist moved faster than Simon's eyes could track. The blow connected squarely with Simon's jaw, a sickening crunch echoing over the noise of the television. Simon crumpled to the filthy carpet like a marionette with its strings cut, spitting blood and a shattered tooth. Silas knelt beside him, grabbing him by the hair and pulling his face up. "Your boy," Silas whispered, "stood in front of his mother to protect her from me. He offered me his last bite of food so I wouldn't kill her." "You aren't just a thief, Simon. You're a parasite." Silas stood up. He grabbed the black duffel bag, quickly inspecting the stacks of cash inside. It was all there. He zipped it shut and slung it over his broad shoulder. "I'm taking the club's money," Silas said, looking down at the broken man writhing on the floor. "But I'm not going to kill you. That would be too easy, and it would leave a body for the cops to find, which brings heat on my chapter." Simon groaned, clutching his ruined jaw, a glimmer of desperate hope flashing in his eyes. "Instead," Silas continued, pulling a burner phone from his pocket, "I'm leaving you right here. But before I kicked your door in, I made a phone call to the Toledo PD. I told them there was a man in room 114, matching the description of a fugitive wanted for armed robbery across state lines. They're on their way. And when you get to prison, Simon, I'll make sure the Aryan Brotherhood inside knows exactly what kind of man you are. A man who throws his own kid to the wolves. The wail of police sirens began to echo faintly in the distance, cutting through the howling snowstorm. Simon's eyes widened in sheer panic. He tried to crawl toward the door, but Silas planted a heavy boot squarely on his back, pinning him to the floor until the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the broken window. Silas slipped out the back window of the bathroom, melting into the snowy darkness just as the police cruisers skidded into the parking lot. 2 days later, the sun broke through the heavy grey clouds over Detroit. Clara Holden walked up the stairs to apartment 4B, holding Toby's hand tightly. She was exhausted, but for the first time in weeks, she wasn't terrified. The electricity was back on. The landlord had miraculously received an anonymous cashier's check covering 6 months of rent in advance. But the biggest shock waited for them at their door. Stacked neatly against the splintered doorframe, which had been roughly but securely patched with new wood, were 6 heavy paper grocery bags. They were overflowing with fresh produce, meats, bread, milk, and a brand new box of Toby's favorite cereal. Sitting on top of the largest bag was a small, white cardboard box. Clara picked it up with trembling hands. Inside were 6 gourmet bakery Pop-Tarts, covered in thick frosting and sprinkles. Underneath the pastry box was a single, unmarked envelope containing the $3,000 Silas had left on the table, which Clara had tried to mail back to the clubhouse address she found online. There was no note. There was no signature. Down on the street, parked halfway down the block in the shadows of a defunct street lamp, Silas Montgomery sat silently on his idling Harley. He watched through the freezing air as the mother and son carried the bags inside, locking the newly repaired door behind them. Silas felt a strange, unfamiliar warmth expanding in his chest. He pulled his leather collar up against the wind, dropped the bike into gear, and rode off into the Detroit skyline, the heavy roar of his engine fading into the city's chaotic hum. If this story of survival, betrayal, and unexpected redemption kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We bring you heart-pounding, real-life inspired tales every week. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss a twist. Share this video with a friend, drop a comment below with your thoughts, and stay tuned for more gripping stories. Blood and chrome don't usually mix with tears and schoolyard bullies. When a trembling 7-year-old boy clutched the heavy leather vest of a fully patched Hell's Angel and begged, "Can you pretend to be my dad?" Nobody expected the roar of 40 V-twin engines to be the answer. The rain was coming down in sheets over Oildale, California, turning the asphalt of Route 99 into a slick, black mirror. Inside the neon-lit confines of Rusty's diner, the air smelled of stale coffee, fried onions, and damp wool. Sitting in a corner booth, his back to the wall, was Arthur Dutch Fallon. Dutch was 52, built like a brick outhouse, and wore the unmistakable 3-piece patch of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. The winged death head sat dead center on his leather cut, flanked by the red and white Bakersfield bottom rocker. Dutch was a man who lived outside the margins of polite society. He had scars that told stories he'd never speak aloud, and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He was halfway through his black coffee when he felt a slight tug on his heavy denim sleeve. Dutch looked down, his hand instinctively dropping toward the heavy buckle of his belt. But it wasn't a threat. It was a kid. The boy couldn't have been older than 7. He was wearing a faded Spider-Man t-shirt that was a size too big, and his sneakers were scuffed. But what caught Dutch's attention wasn't the worn-out clothes. It was the sheer, paralyzing terror in the kid's eyes. Tears were cutting clean tracks through the dirt on his cheeks. His lower lip was trembling so violently he could barely speak. "Mister," the boy whispered, his voice cracking, "please, can you pretend to be my dad?" Dutch frowned, his thick eyebrows knitting together. He looked past the boy and saw a woman huddled 2 booths away. She was in her late 20s, her face pale, frantically trying to make herself as small as possible behind a laminated menu. A purple bruise was blooming along her jawline. "What's your name, kid?" Dutch asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that usually intimidated grown men. "T. Tommy," the boy stammered, his small fingers still gripping the thick leather of Dutch's cut. "He's coming. He's outside. He says he's going to take me away from Mum. Please." Before Dutch could ask who he was, the diner's front door chimed. The heavy glass door swung open, letting in a gust of cold, wet wind. A man stepped inside. He was tall, wearing a tailored grey suit that cost more than the waitress made in a month. He had the clean-cut, arrogant swagger of a man who owned the room. But Dutch noticed the telltale bulge beneath the man's left armpit, a shoulder holster. Dutch glanced at the mother. She had completely frozen, her eyes wide with a familiar, suffocating panic. A biker's instinct. Dutch didn't need a police report to understand the dynamic in the room. He knew predators when he saw them, and the man in the suit had the scent of a predator who used a badge to hide his sins. "Sit down, Tommy," Dutch said quietly, sliding over in the vinyl booth. "You like pancakes?" Tommy nodded, his eyes darting towards the front door. "Then sit. And eat." Dutch handed the boy a piece of bacon from his plate. The man in the suit scanned the diner, his eyes locked onto the mother, a cruel smile twisting his lips. He started walking toward her booth, his leather shoes clicking against the linoleum. But as he passed Dutch's table, he finally noticed Tommy. "Well, well," the man said, stopping in his tracks. "There you are, you little brat. Get up. You're coming with me. Your mother and I have things to discuss." Tommy shrank back, pressing himself against Dutch's massive arm. Dutch didn't move. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee, set the mug down on the saucer, and finally looked up. "Excuse me," Dutch said, the silence in the diner suddenly deafening. "You're interrupting my breakfast with my son." The man in the suit blinked, caught completely off guard. He looked at Dutch, taking in the heavy beard, the tattoos crawling up his neck, and the Hell's Angels patch, and let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Your son?" the man sneered. "Listen, Trash, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I'm Detective Ray Mitchell, Kern County Narcotics. That boy is my stepson, and I'm taking him." Mitchell reached into his jacket, resting his hand casually near his holster, a classic intimidation tactic. Dutch didn't flinch. He slowly wiped his mouth with a paper napkin, leaned forward, and locked eyes with the detective. "I don't care if you're the Pope," Dutch said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the lethal calm of a coiled rattlesnake. "The boy said I'm his dad today, and since he's sitting at my table, eating my bacon, that makes him mine. Now, you can turn around and walk out that door, or we can see how fast that badge melts when things get hot." The diner was dead silent. The grill cook had stopped scraping the flat top. The waitress was standing frozen behind the counter. Mitchell's face flushed crimson. He was used to civilians cowering. He wasn't used to staring down a patched member of the world's most notorious motorcycle club, a man who clearly had absolutely nothing to lose. "You're interfering with police business," Mitchell hissed, though he took a half-step back. "I have a court order for custody. Tomorrow is the father-son breakfast at West Park Elementary. I'll be there to take him, officially. If you or his whore of a mother try to stop me, I'll have you both locked up." Mitchell glared at Tommy, Enjoy the pancakes, kid. I'll see you tomorrow at 8 a.m. With a final disgusted look at Dutch, the detective turned and walked out into the rain. The second the door closed, Tommy's mother rushed over, collapsing into the booth opposite Dutch. She pulled Tommy into her arms, sobbing uncontrollably. "I'm sorry," she wept, looking at Dutch with a mixture of terror and immense gratitude. "I'm so sorry to involve you. My name is Elena. Ray, he used his connections to get full custody. He beats us, but the local judges play golf with him. He told me if I didn't hand Tommy over tomorrow at the school event, he'd plant drugs in my car and make sure I go to prison." Dutch sat back, processing the information. The Hells Angels had a complicated relationship with the law, but there was a universal code among the Brotherhood. You don't mess with kids, and you despise a dirty cop who uses his power to abuse the weak. "West Park Elementary?" Dutch asked quietly. Elena nodded, wiping her eyes. "Yes. The school is hosting a big outdoor breakfast. Ray wants to make a public show of taking Tommy away from me there, to humiliate me. Tommy doesn't have a father. Ray thinks it's a joke." Tommy, still clutching his half-eaten bacon, looked up at Dutch. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, battered plastic army man. He slid it across the table toward the biker. "Thank you for being my dad today," Tommy whispered. Dutch stared at the small green toy. He thought about his own son, who he had lost to a drunk driver 10 years ago. The pain of that loss was an open wound that had never truly healed. He picked up the plastic soldier, his massive, calloused fingers dwarfing the toy, and slipped it into his leather vest pocket. "Listen to me, Elena," Dutch said, his voice firm but surprisingly gentle. "You take Tommy to that school tomorrow. You hold your head up high." Elena looked terrified. "But Ray will be there." "I know," Dutch replied, throwing a $20 bill onto the table. He slid out of the booth and stood up to his full 6'3" height. "Tommy asked me to pretend to be his dad. I don't break promises to kids." Dutch walked out into the rain, swung a leg over his customized Harley-Davidson diner, and kicked the engine to life. He didn't ride home. He rode straight to the fortified clubhouse on the edge of town. When Dutch walked into the main room, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the sound of a pool game. Sitting at the head of a massive oak table was Big Jim Lawson, the president of the Bakersfield Charter. Dutch walked up to the table and slammed his fist down, rattling the empty beer bottles. "Jim," Dutch said, the fire burning fiercely in his eyes, "I need to call a church meeting. Right now. We have a ride tomorrow morning, and we're going to an elementary school." The atmosphere inside the Bakersfield Hells Angels clubhouse was thicker than the cigar smoke hanging in the rafters. The main hall, usually a place of raucous laughter, clinking beer bottles, and heavy rock music, was dead silent. 40 patched members sat around the massive oak table and lined the wood-paneled walls. They were men carved from rough stone, mechanics, construction workers, and outlaws, wearing their road-worn leathers like armor. Dutch stood at the head of the table, directly to the right of Big Jim Lawson, the club president. Big Jim was a towering figure with a silver beard that reached his chest and arms, thick with faded prison ink. He listened intently as Dutch recounted the scene at Rusty's diner. Dutch didn't leave a single detail out. The bruises on Elena's face, the arrogant swagger of Detective Ray Mitchell, and most importantly, the sheer, paralyzing terror of a 7-year-old boy holding a plastic army man. When Dutch finished speaking, he took the small, green plastic toy out of his pocket and set it softly on the scarred oak table. It stood there, a tiny, fragile symbol in a room full of hardened giants. "The cop thinks he owns the town," Dutch said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that echoed off the walls. "He's using his badge to beat on a woman and terrorize a kid. He told the boy he's taking him tomorrow at the West Park Elementary father-son breakfast. The kid asked me to be his dad. I told him I would." Big Jim stared at the plastic soldier for a long, heavy moment. The silence stretched, tense and expectant. Finally, the president leaned back in his heavy leather chair, the wood creaking under his massive frame. He looked around the room, making eye contact with every single brother present, from Iron Mike Sullivan, the sergeant-at-arms, to Bones Harrison, the newest patch holder. "We've got a lot of history with the Kern County Sheriff's Department," Big Jim rumbled, his voice like grinding tectonic plates. "Some good, mostly bad. But a badge doesn't give a man the right to put his hands on a mother. And it sure as hell doesn't give him the right to break a kid's spirit." Big Jim stood up, picking up the plastic army man and handing it back to Dutch. "Tomorrow morning, 7:30 a.m., Big Jim announced, his voice suddenly sharp and commanding. "Kickstands up. We wear full patches. We ride in formation. And we show this dirty detective what a real family looks like. Anyone who has a problem with that, speak now." Not a single man moved. Then Iron Mike slammed his heavy silver rings against the table. "I'm in," he grunted. Within seconds, a chorus of heavy boots stomping the floorboards and fists pounding the table filled the room. The vote was unanimous. The next morning broke with crisp, clear California sunshine, entirely ignorant of the storm that was about to hit West Park Elementary. The school's athletic field had been transformed into a picturesque suburban dream. Checkered plastic tablecloths draped over folding tables, orange juice chilled in large plastic coolers, and the air smelled of maple syrup and freshly cut grass. Fathers in polo shirts, khaki shorts, and neatly pressed suits stood in small clusters, drinking bad coffee from styrofoam cups and boasting about their golf handicaps. Children chased each other around the perimeter, their laughter ringing through the morning air. Standing near the edge of the playground, completely isolated from the cheerful crowd, was Eleanor. She held Tommy's hand so tightly, her knuckles were white. The bruises on her face were clumsily hidden beneath thick layers of foundation, but the absolute dread in her eyes couldn't be concealed. Tommy was wearing a freshly ironed button-down shirt, nervously kicking the dirt with his scuffed sneakers. He kept looking toward the street, searching the passing minivans and sedans. "He's coming, Mum," Tommy whispered, his voice shaking. "He promised." Elena swallowed hard, fighting back tears. She knelt down and hugged her son. "Oh, sweetie. People like that. They don't mean to break their promises, but they have their own lives. We just have to be strong. Just you and me, okay? Well, isn't this a touching scene?" The sneering voice cut through the air like a rusty blade. Detective Ray Mitchell strutted across the grass, holding 2 plates of pancakes. He wore a sharp navy suit, his badge clipped ostentatiously to his belt next to his service weapon. He smiled, but the warmth never reached his cold, dead eyes. The nearby parents gave him respectful nods, completely unaware of the monster lurking beneath the tailored wool. "Ray, please," Elena begged quietly, stepping in front of Tommy. "Don't do this here. Don't make a scene in front of his friends." "I'm not making a scene, Elena," Mitchell mocked, his voice dripping with condescension. "I'm just a loving stepfather here to exercise my legal, court-ordered rights. The judge signed the papers at 10 p.m. last night. Full temporary custody pending investigation. You really shouldn't have associated with biker trash, Elena. It makes you look like an unfit mother." He reached out and forcefully grabbed Tommy by the shoulder. The boy shrieked and tried to pull away, but Mitchell's grip was like an iron vice. "Let him go!" Elena cried out, grabbing Mitchell's arm. Several fathers looked over, their brows furrowed, but Mitchell quickly flashed his badge. "Police business, folks. Just dealing with a domestic custody issue. Nothing to worry about." The fathers quickly looked away, not wanting to get involved. Mitchell leaned in close to Eleanor, his breath smelling of stale mints and malice. "I told you I'd break you," he hissed. "Come on, kid, we're leaving." Tommy dug his heels into the grass, tears streaming down his face. He looked desperately toward the street. "Where is he?" the boy sobbed. "He promised." "Nobody is coming to save you, kid," Mitchell laughed darkly. But then the ground began to vibrate. It started as a low, guttural thrumming, a deep bass note that seemed to rattle the styrofoam cups on the folding tables. The fathers stopped talking. The kids stopped running. Even Mitchell paused, loosening his grip slightly on Tommy's shoulder. The thrumming grew louder, building into a deafening, mechanical roar that echoed off the brick walls of the school building. It sounded like a rolling earthquake. Around the corner of Elm Street, a solitary motorcycle appeared. It was a massive, custom-built Harley-Davidson, gleaming with chrome and matte black paint. Riding it was Arthur Dutch Fallon, his leather cut flapping slightly in the wind, the Hells Angels' death head patch catching the morning sun. But Dutch wasn't alone. Behind him, riding two abreast in perfect disciplined formation, was a river of heavy American iron. 5 bikes, 10, 20. 40 heavily customized motorcycles roared down the quiet suburban street, an overwhelming tidal wave of leather, denim, beards, and thunder. The convoy turned into the school parking lot, engines revving, exhaust pipes spitting defiance. The PTA mums gasped, clutching their pearls. The suburban dads took several nervous steps back. This was the raw, unfiltered, dangerous edge of society crashing directly into their pristine world. Dutch kicked his stand down and killed his engine. Behind him, 39 other engines cut off in near-perfect unison. The sudden silence that followed was heavier and more intimidating than the roar of the exhaust. 40 men dismounted. They moved with a calm, deliberate purpose. Big Jim, Iron Mike, Bones, and the rest of the Brotherhood formed a massive wall behind Dutch as he unhooked his heavy chain wallet and began walking across the grass directly toward Detective Mitchell. The crowd parted for the bikers like the Red Sea. Nobody breathed. Tommy's tear-streaked face lit up with an incandescent joy. He ripped his shoulder out of Mitchell's loosened grip and ran as fast as his little legs could carry him. "Dad!" Tommy yelled at the top of his lungs. Dutch dropped to one knee, catching the boy in his massive, tattooed arms. He lifted Tommy off the ground, holding him tight against his leather vest. "Hey, son," Dutch said softly, loud enough for the terrified crowd to hear. "Sorry I'm late. Hit some traffic." Mitchell's face cycled through shock, confusion, and finally, a deep, humiliated rage. He instinctively dropped his hand to the butt of his service weapon. "You step away from that boy," Mitchell barked, his voice cracking slightly under the pressure of 40 sets of cold, calculating eyes staring him down. "You have no legal right to be here. I am a sworn officer of the law, and I have a judge's order." Dutch slowly stood up, keeping Tommy safely tucked behind his massive frame. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The quiet menace radiating from the men behind him was enough to freeze the blood in Mitchell's veins. "A judge's order." Big Jim stepped forward, his towering frame casting a long shadow over the detective. "That's funny. We brought our own paperwork." From the back of the pack of bikers stepped a man who didn't fit in at all. He wasn't wearing leather. He was wearing a sharp, custom-tailored charcoal suit and carrying a leather briefcase. This was Harvey the Shark Sterling, the most feared defense attorney in Kern County. The club paid him a small fortune on retainer, and he was worth every penny. Sterling adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and walked right up to Mitchell, who suddenly looked very pale. Detective Ray Mitchell, Sterling said pleasantly, opening his briefcase. I represent Mr. Fallon, the club, and as of 6 a.m. this morning, Ms. Elena Jenkins. I hold here an emergency federal injunction signed by a federal circuit judge in Los Angeles just 3 hours ago. Mitchell blinked. Federal? What are you talking about? It seems my clients are very resourceful. Sterling smiled thinly, pulling out a thick stack of photographs and documents. Last night, while you were sleeping, a few of Mr. Fallon's associates took a ride down to your lockup facility. They found the locker where you've been stashing the narcotics you skimming from evidence. They also took a ride to see 3 of your former confidential informants, who were more than happy to sign sworn affidavits regarding your extortion racket in exchange for our protection. Mitchell staggered back a step. The color completely drained from his face. The suburban dads and PTA mums were whispering frantically now, the illusion of the noble detective entirely shattered. I don't know what you're talking about, Mitchell stammered, his hand shaking. You planted that. This is intimidation. No, detective, Sterling corrected smoothly. Intimidation is what you did to this woman and child. What we are doing is executing the law. If you look behind you, you'll see we didn't just bring bikers. Mitchell spun around. Pulling into the parking lot with their lights flashing silently were 3 black SUVs. Men in windbreakers bearing the letters FBI stepped out, accompanied by 2 officers from the Kern County Internal Affairs Division. Big Jim had made a call last night, all right. He had called a federal prosecutor who owed the club a massive favor for a tip that had dismantled a rival cartel operation years ago. The Hells Angels didn't just use muscle, they used a leverage, and they had gathered enough leverage on Mitchell overnight to bury him under a federal prison for 20 years. Detective Mitchell, the lead IA officer called out, walking across the grass with handcuffs already unclipped. We need your badge and your weapon, right now. You're under arrest for corruption, evidence tampering, and extortion. Mitchell looked frantically around. He looked at the FBI agents. He looked at his peers. And finally, he looked at Dutch. The biker simply stood there, an immovable mountain of justice wrapped in black leather. Mitchell slowly raised his hands, surrendering his weapon. As the agents slapped the cuffs on his wrists and marched him away in front of the entire school, the playground erupted into stunned murmurs. Elena collapsed to her knees, burying her face in her hands, sobbing. But this time, they were tears of profound, overwhelming relief. Dutch walked over to her and gently offered her a massive, calloused hand. He pulled her to her feet. It's over, Elena, he said softly. He's never coming near you or the boy again. Tommy ran over and hugged his mother, then turned to Dutch. He looked up at the giant biker, then looked at the 39 other scary-looking men standing behind him. Are all of them my uncles now? Tommy asked innocently. A roar of genuine, booming laughter erupted from the Hells Angels. The tension evaporated, replaced by the deep camaraderie of a brotherhood that had just done exactly what they set out to do. Yeah, kid, Iron Mike grinned, slapping his heavy leather gloves together. We're all your uncles. Now who's got the pancakes? I'm starving. To the absolute shock of the West Park Elementary PTA, 40 patched members of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club spent the next hour sitting at tiny folding tables, eating syrupy pancakes and swapping stories with a 7-year-old boy. Dutch sat at the head of the table, Tommy right beside him. The boy wasn't looking at the street anymore. He wasn't afraid. For the first time in his life, Tommy knew what it felt like to be completely, untouchably safe. Before the club finally mounted up to leave, Dutch knelt down in front of Tommy one last time. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out the green plastic army man. He pressed it back into Tommy's small palm. You keep this, Dutch said, tapping the winged patch on his own chest. "If you ever need an army again, you know exactly who to call." The world is often quick to judge a book by its worn, leather-bound cover, but true morality rarely wears a pressed suit. That morning, a group of outlaws proved that family isn't defined by blood or the law, but by who shows up when you are terrified and alone. Sometimes, the most fierce protectors are the ones society tells you to fear the most. Desperation breeds crazy courage. A skinny 14-year-old kid walked into a smoke-filled biker bar looking for honest work. He expected rejection. He expected ridicule. What he never saw coming was a thunderous roar of 40 Harley-Davidsons shaking his front porch, changing his family's destiny forever. Lowell, Massachusetts, in late November, is a city that forgets how to be warm. The wind howls off the Merrimack River, biting through thin jackets and rattling loose window panes in the cheaper apartment complexes. On the third floor of one of these crumbling brick buildings lived 14-year-old Leo Caldwell and his mother, Sarah. Their apartment smelled of bleach, stale radiator dust, and the sharp, metallic tang of sickness. Sarah had been battling severe renal failure for over 2 years. The dialysis treatments kept her alive, but they were a brutal, exhausting anchor that drained her energy and their bank account. Before the illness, she had worked double shifts at a diner on Middlesex Street, always making sure Leo had warm boots and a hot dinner. Now, she spent her days confined to a faded floral armchair, wrapped in layers of blankets, her skin pale and translucent. Leo was forced to grow up long before his time. He knew exactly which floorboards creaked. He knew how to water down the milk so it lasted until Thursday. He knew the precise tone of voice the landlord used when an eviction notice was imminent. And this week, that tone had turned from annoyed to definitive. They were 3 months behind on rent. The medical debt was a mountain they could not climb, and the state assistants barely covered Sarah's prescriptions. "I'm sorry, Leo," Sarah whispered, one Tuesday evening, her voice trembling as she stared at the pile of final notice envelopes on the chipped Formica kitchen table. "I never wanted you to have to worry about this. I'm trying to figure it out." "Don't worry, Mom," Leo lied, offering her a brave, practiced smile. "I've got a plan." He didn't have a plan. He had spent the last 3 weeks begging for under-the-table work. He had walked miles, knocking on the back doors of grocery stores, auto shops and restaurants. Every manager took one look at his scrawny frame, his oversized thrift store jacket, and his desperate eyes, and shook their heads. "Liability," they said. "Too young," they said. "Come back in a few years, kid." But a few years was a luxury the Caldwells didn't have. They didn't even have a few weeks. The landlord had given them until Friday to come up with $600, or the locks would be changed. By Wednesday afternoon, the cold was biting, and Leo's desperation had morphed into a reckless, quiet panic. He was walking down a grim industrial stretch of marginal roads near the city outskirts when he saw it. The Broken Spoke. It wasn't just a bar, it was a fortress. The exterior was painted matte black, the windows completely boarded up and covered in faded concert flyers. Out front, lined up with military precision, were a dozen gleaming, heavily customized Harley-Davidson motorcycles. This was the undisputed territory of the local Hells Angels chapter. Everyone in Lowell knew you didn't look at the Broken Spoke too long, you didn't park near it, and you certainly didn't walk through its heavy, steel-reinforced front door unless you wore their patch. Leo stood across the street, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He had heard the rumors. He knew the reputation of the men who drank inside. They were dangerous. They operated by their own set of rules. But as Leo looked at the massive, gleaming chrome engines of the bikes, Another thought pushed its way to the forefront of his mind. They have money, and bikes need to be cleaned. His mother's coughing fit from that morning echoed in his ears. The image of the eviction notice burned in his mind. Fear was a luxury for people who had a warm bed to sleep in. Leo pulled his thin jacket tighter around his shoulders, took a deep breath that felt like swallowing ice, and crossed the street. The heavy oak door of the Broken Spoke swung open with a slow, ominous groan. The moment Leo stepped over the threshold, the atmosphere hit him like a physical blow. The air was thick, blue with cigarette smoke, and smelled heavily of stale beer, aged leather, and gasoline. Classic rock blared from a jukebox in the corner, but it couldn't entirely drown out the low, rumbling murmur of a dozen deep voices. Every head in the bar turned. The silence that fell was immediate and suffocating. A pool game in the back corner stopped midway through a shot. The bartender, a massive man with a thick beard and a scar running through his left eyebrow, paused with a rag halfway inside a pint glass. Seated at the bar and scattered across the worn booths were men who looked like they were carved from granite and bad intentions. They wore heavy leather cuts, the iconic Death Head logo emblazoned on their backs. Tattoos crawled up their necks and knuckles. Leo stood frozen by the door, his heart hammering against his ribs like a